So we intentionally picked a keynote. The biggest question we had, who do we pick that will have the most likelihood of making us all feel incredibly insecure? And so we were fortunate to be able to get Dr. Leo Celi. Leo is a clinical research director and senior research scientist at the Laboratory for Computational Physiology at MIT, and a practicing intensivist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. Dr. Celi's work focuses on scaling clinical research to be more inclusive through open access data and software, particularly for limited resource settings, identifying bias in the data to prevent them from being encrypted in models and algorithms, and redesigning research using the principles of team science and the hive learning strategy. Dr. Celi, as the Slido exercise, as you saw from the Slido exercise, completed his medical degree at the University of Philippines, followed by postgraduate training in internal medicine, critical care medicine, infectious disease, and biomedical informatics, if that wasn't enough, at Cleveland Clinic, Harvard, Stanford, and MIT. My mom would just be so disappointed in me right now. He has published numerous papers in machine learning, not only in critical care medicine, but across different specialties, including ophthalmology, radiology, surgery, nursing, and bioethics. I'd like to now, after that introduction, you can clearly see why we've asked him to be our keynote. I'd like to pass it off to Dr. Celi for his keynote. Thank you, Leo. Thank you so much, Leo.
Thanks. It's an honor to be here at the Mecca of Health AI, and that's actually true. It's not Duke, it's not Mayo Clinic, it's not Stanford, it's actually the University of Toronto, and definitely not Harvard and MIT. So I'm glad to be back here. And I'm hoping to wake you up and engage you in a very rich discussion after the talk. I'm gonna try to shorten it to maybe even 35 minutes, so we will have more back and forth discussion afterwards. But we have just wrapped up our 50th Datathon. We started organizing these events back in 2014. And there has been some seismic shift in the way we conduct them. In the past, it would ask teams to develop the most accurate model and evaluate it against real-world data. And then somewhere along the line, we realized this is the perfect recipe to develop models that will actually encrypt societal inequities, the problems that we see. So now our focus is, can we have the teams understand the data first before they start doing their exploratory data analysis? Where are the sources of data bias? Who were the people who got into the database and who were excluded from being able to be captured in the database? Are the medical devices that we use to capture data, do they work consistently across different population and patients? And then, are patients being monitored with the same frequency regardless of their skin color or their ability to speak English? The answer to those questions, as we all know, is no. So now let's pause and ruminate. Well, how does that impact the way we develop prediction, classification, and optimization tasks? And that is the question that no one knows the answer. So I think we're really starting the journey. There are still so many things that we need to figure out before we could fully incorporate AI into every sector of our lives. Before proceeding, I wanted to declare that I have no conflict of interest relevant to this presentation, but our group receives research funding from the US government through the National Institute of Health and several industry partners. So we've been hearing so much about artificial intelligence. Last year was proclaimed really the modern age of artificial intelligence, and for several reasons. In April of last year, OpenAI released DALL-E 2, which is an image generating artificial intelligence using text prompts. And this is leveraging a technology called latent diffusion. In September of last year, this was made available to the public. And then in, I believe, June of 2022, DeepMind announced that it is releasing AlphaFold, which is an AI that would predict the structure of every protein that has known genomic sequence. And what's more impressive is that they released all these predicted protein structures and shared it with the rest of the world at the European Molecular Laboratory Institute. And these protein structures became available to researchers from around the world and used them for research in medicine as well as biological sciences. August 2022, Stability AI and Computational released Stable Diffusion, and it came as an open source project complete with code source and checkpoint files. And anyone can use Stable Diffusion in your own PCs, of course, as long as you have enough GPUs. But soon after, the critics were very alarmed to say that this could contribute to alternative histories, to non-consensual pornography, to child sexual abuse material. Later in that month of August 2022, a Colorado resident named Jason Allen won a digital photography competition using AI, and the whole world flipped out. November of 2022, Meta announced that their AI tool called Cicero has mastered the online board game Diplomacy. And Diplomacy is a board game that requires the players to talk to each other. It also requires persuasion, negotiation, and cooperation to win. And none of the players knew that they were playing against an AI. So this was truly the moment that AI has passed the Alan Turing test. And of course, December 2022, OpenAI released ChatGPT, and it was the first time that such a technology became available to people using a very user-friendly web interface. And within 5 days of release, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, announced that it has reached over 1 million users. And within 2 months, this has reached 100 million users around the world. And soon after, we read study after study about the capabilities of this technology. In medicine, it has passed every exam known to man and woman. In medicine, we hear that it was able to guess a diagnosis of CPC cases. And these are very complex medical scenarios, actual patients that were very challenging for the clinicians to come up with a diagnosis. And months after the release of ChatGPT, we hear that health systems are deploying large language models within their electronic health record system. Let me jump right into my key message. If we are to develop AI and evaluate them using accuracy against real-world data, the world is doomed. It means that we will be encrypting, we will be encoding all the systemic inequities that we see in the world now. There is this article from Bloomberg where they presented a study performed by their investigators, and they used, I believe, Stable Diffusion, and asked Stable Diffusion to generate images of 14 jobs, 7 that are known to be high-paying jobs wherever you are in the world, and 7 that are considered low-paying jobs. And it asked for 300 images for each of those jobs. On the left, you see the images generated when the text prompt was, "Give me an image of a CEO." And on the right are the images generated when they asked for images of fast food workers. And you could see the discrepancy of the images that were generated. For the most part, males were dominating all the jobs, and women only started appearing when they were asking for images of low-paying jobs, such as cashiers and fast food workers. And the same findings were observed when looking at skin tone. So as you saw in the picture previously, CEO images were primarily white men. And we think that this is the largest threat in the use of large language models, large foundation models in healthcare as well as in other sectors. In healthcare, we published this paper last summer, and what we did was to use identical text prompts and asked GPT-4, can you come up with differential diagnosis using case vignettes from the New England Journal of Medicine. And we used exactly the same text prompt, but we were changing the sex and the race ethnicity of the patient each time. There were two separate tasks. The first was differential diagnosis, and then the second was, can you give us some guidance on what workup should we be doing? This is a busy slide, but I don't want you to get intimidated. I will tell you the summary observations that we found. And I will give you two examples that we thought really pounce on the message that we have to be careful in using large language models because the vast majority of digitized content scraped from the internet would come from rich countries, rich research institutions that scream the loudest when it comes to digital content. So when we gave it a text prompt describing a patient with pulmonary embolus, a blood clot in the lung, and the manifestation of that is shortness of breath, what we found is that if the patient were a woman, the diagnosis of anxiety disorder and panic attack ranks so much higher as compared to if the patient were a man. When we gave it a text prompt involving a college student with sore throat, if the patient were a black male college student, acute HIV and syphilis would rank higher. And we actually compared this with the actual prevalence. So we looked at what does the world look like to a large language model. How many times would it see black males associated with acute HIV, women associated with just a hysterical disorder? And we found that it augmented these harmful stereotypes. So the world, according to large language model, is very different from the world that we see now. And then more alarmingly, when we were asking GPT-4, what should we be doing for this case presenting at the emergency department? And what we found is across all the diagnoses, the likelihood that it will recommend CT scan or referral to a specialist is higher if the patient were white. So it has learned that urban myth that for the most part, black patients are only malingering, they're there to ask for narcotics, and they do not deserve to be worked up further with a CT scan or a consultation of a specialist. And we see AI-fueled chatbots after another promising that they could provide mental health counseling. But we also know that the vast majority of content in the internet would reflect Western frameworks for mental health. And there have been studies after studies that have demonstrated that if you apply Western mental health frameworks to treat depression, schizophrenia in non-Western countries, that they produce more harm than good. And this is what's going to happen even if you fine-tune large language models on local corpus, which, by the way, almost never happens. So currently, this is the setup in making sure that the large language models are not biased. We loop in humans at the fine-tuning portion. This is called reinforcement learning from human feedback. And it's a red teaming process. What we try to do is, can we quickly identify when the prompts are racist, sexist, or ableist? And can we prevent large language models from providing outputs that are racist, sexist, or ableist? But the way we do this, we're only looking for overtly racist, sexist, and ableist and other forms of prejudice in the text prompts or in the output. And I could tell you, and as we all know, most of the prejudices and biases that we have are much more subtle. And it's also, there is some circular fallacy logic that the same humans who produce the world that is captured by biased data are themselves capable of creating large language models and large foundation models that are not biased. And our analogy for that is you raise your kid to be racist, sexist, and ableist, and then you expect him to undergo cultural sensitivity training as an adult. It's too late. You have to start training the kid to be not racist, sexist, or ableist from the very start. You cannot do that at the very end. And we have been working with MedPalm, with Bloom, and no one knows how to do this yet. No one knows how to generate a database that will be less biased, less prejudiced. As I said, the focus right now is how do we evaluate them at the end, and let's continue with the fine-tuning at the very final stage of the development of large language models. Detecting bias in numeric data is even so much more difficult than detecting bias in language. And this is a list, and it's by no means comprehensive, of some of the sources of data bias when you're working with numeric data. I'm just going to highlight two of them, the bias from medical device and the sampling selection bias. And for the bias from medical device, the most popular one, as we know, is the pulse oximeter, which is a device that uses infrared sensing technology to estimate the amount of oxygen in the bloodstream. And we have heard that it is racist. It does not work well for individuals of color. So that means that a certain number would mean different depending on the color of the skin. And the computers do not know that. The agent that you're using to develop a model does not know this information, so that these are all captured in the models that you're building. And we published this review this past summer where we showed that the pulse oximeter is the tip of the iceberg. We identified about 10 devices in the ICU that are known to perform differently depending on your body habitus, depending on the type of hair that you have. So the EEG that we see, the leads that we use to capture the brain signals, they don't stick well if you have a certain type of hair, and you see a lot of artifacts. The EEG that we use to capture the electrical activity of the heart, the amplitude is very small if you're large-breasted, if you're morbidly obese. So how many heart attacks did we miss? How many epilepsies did we misdiagnose because of medical device that is not consistently performing across different patient populations? This is my favorite example of sampling selection bias. It is perhaps the most notorious reason why you will have spurious associations in the database. And the spurious associations, if you're not careful, will be used by your algorithm. It will be part of your decision-making process. This is a paper that came out in the midst of the pandemic, and it's looking at what are the predictors of mortality for patients admitted to the hospital during the COVID era. And it used data coming from the Veterans Administration. So there you could see right away that this is perfect recipe for sampling selection bias. This is the main table in that particular study. In the upper third of the table, we see that the older you are, the higher likelihood that you're gonna die. The odds ratios are higher, and that's no surprise. But if you look at the middle third and the lower third of the table, you would find that people who never smoked are more likely to die from COVID, and that people who are obese are more likely to survive from COVID. For people who were working at the front lines of care during the pandemic, we know that this is not true. We know that there were more overweight people who ended up in the intensive care unit and dying. We know that the people who have extensive smoking history are more likely to have a severe degree of lung damage. So what happened? It turns out that among veterans, there are far more smokers than non-smokers. In fact, non-smokers are a rarity among veterans. And if you're a non-smoker and you develop COVID, it's unlikely that you will be admitted to the hospital. So now the population that you're building your model on is no longer representative of the population that you would like to deploy your model to help with their diagnosis and treatment. And we see this in almost every paper that we review that develops models even the ones that don't use artificial intelligence. We see this all the time as well in clinical research. The other example that I give about sampling selection bias, which I alluded to earlier, is knowing exactly how patients got into the database. If you're working with Mimic, who made it to the ICU in our area and who did not make it to the ICU? Because again, that changes really the composition of the patients. And that also changes the association between the features and the outcome that you're trying to predict or optimize. This is a study that was published in December 2022, where it showed that in the United States, if you had an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, the likelihood that someone is going to perform CPR on you is lower if you were Black or Hispanic. That means that if you are Black or Hispanic and you develop out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, the less chances for you to reach the hospital alive, because there's less chances that someone is going to try to resuscitate you. This means, too, that the Blacks and Hispanics in Mimic are different from the Blacks and Hispanics who did not make it to your database. So this idea that we could oversample the minority population to have some balance in your patient composition does not work, because the people who were there are very different from the people who did not make it. And this is very true for those who are developing models using the transplant list, because the minority patients who made it to the transplant list are very different from the minority patients who were excluded from being evaluated for transplant. Therefore, you're going to have all these spurious associations. In late 2013, Robert McDaniel, who lived in the south side of Chicago, received an unexpected knock from the commander of the police department of Chicago. And he was warned that he should refrain from committing any further violent crimes. And the visit took him by surprise, because he has never been arrested. He has never had any encounter with the law enforcement. But it turns out that Robert McDaniel was in the hit list of about 400 individuals, mostly Black men, that was in the Chicago Police Department list. And this is one of the examples of the growing suite of big data systems that are being deployed in police departments, not just in the United States, but also in Europe. And of course, these algorithms are proprietary. We don't know how they were developed, and chances are they are going to be very biased. It turns out that AI sucks when the ground truth is not clear, and when reasonable people like us can disagree about what is the correct answer. But despite that, a lot of companies are still saying that they could predict the future. One example is HireVue, which has an algorithm that could predict the personality of a job applicant by asking them to answer questions such as, is your desk messy? That sounds to me like a horoscope being given based on your zodiac sign. Despite that, this algorithm decides the fate of millions of job applicants every month. Another company, EAB Navigate in the United States, has a software that will predict the likelihood of a high school student applying to college. What is the chances that they will drop out of college? And once again, it's a proprietary algorithm. No one can look under the hood and inspect this algorithm for biases and errors. In the healthcare domain, this is an example of a black box proprietary algorithm. So APRIS has come to dominate the state prescription databases. Their flagship product is called NarxCare, and it provides a pharmacist or a healthcare provider a score of the likelihood that this patient will develop narcotic addiction. And in a lot of states, providers and pharmacists are required to run this algorithm and decide whether I should be prescribing Vicodin or Percocet to this patient coming in with back pain. Just like EAB Navigate, it's a proprietary algorithm. We don't know how this was developed. We don't know who developed the algorithm. but it's being used now across the United States. You would think that the pandemic would leapfrog the application of AI in helping us diagnose and treat COVID. But out of 415 algorithms that were published during the pandemic, not a single one was good enough to be able to be deployed in clinical practice. There were some, but they were quickly retracted because it was discovered to be not accurate. So there are 4 mental models of the world, and I'm going to add a 5th one. The first mental model of the world is the world that we envision, the world that is fair, the world where everyone has access to quality health care. That does not exist, as we know. And then there is the mental model of the world as it is now. It is full of inequities. It is full of biases. And then there's a third mental model of the world, and that is the mental model of the world as it exists in the data. And that is even farther away from the world that we aspire to have. And that is because of this concept of social patterning of the data generation process, which I have just described. So data is not being collected at the same frequency across patient population. And for that reason, the data, according to the world according to the data, is even more biased. And the 4th mental model of the world is the world that will be encoded, the world that will be preserved if we are to deploy artificial intelligence. And this is even farther away from the world that we want. And that is because most of the AI developers are oblivious to this social patterning of the data generation process. I will add a 5th mental model of the world, and this is the world according to the peddlers of artificial intelligence. And in this world, social problems can be fixed by for-profit data-driven solutions. Efficiency is the most important virtue in this world, but we ask ourselves, efficiency for whom? In this world, AI does not truly understand the messy interplay of values, missions, and traditions at the heart of institutions. And this cannot be understood if we're only scratching the data surface of these institutions. In this world's investment in technology will augment human intelligence more than investment on education and culture and the institutions that nurture them. And finally, in this world, those who sit at the table, those who are charting the course of AI, are all-knowing and are benevolent. This reminds me of the parable of women who would fetch water at the next village and walking 2 hours each day to be able to get access to safe water. And at one time, there was a philanthropic organization who traveled to this village. They observed the women walking 1 hour to the next village to fetch water and then 1 hour back. And they said, we're going to fix your problem. We're going to build a well right in the center of the village so that you save 2 hours a day. And just imagine what you could do with those extra 2 hours. So they did that. They left. They went back to their comfy lives in their own countries. And then they wanted to go back a year after to take photos of the achievements that they had created as a result of their the well that they had built. And what do they observe? They go back to the country, to the village, and they observe exactly the same thing. Women are walking 1 hour to the next village with their large containers and coming back. And they were aghast. Like, why are you doing this? We built a well right in the middle of your village. And the women said, those 2 hours that we go to fetch water, those are the only 2 hours we could stay away from our husbands. Those are the best parts of our day, and how dare you take that away from us? And this is a recurring lesson for us who live in the developed world, that we know what's best for our colleagues in the developing world. We could solve their problem. We don't need their contribution, their feedback, their input. We don't need them in the design thinking process. So how do we move forward after all of these alarming observations that I have just laid out in front of you? There are 2 paths forward. Well, there's one path forward, and it has 2 requirements. The first requirement is regulation, guardrails. We need them to make sure that AI is not going to replace a bad system with an even worse system. Not the regulation that the White House said that industry is able to come up for their own companies. So as we know, self-regulation does not exist in a marketplace that is prioritizing profit. This past summer, we see the first draft of the EU AI Act, and it's actually a very good document if you have time to skim it over. It is the first to propose principles for generative AI regulation, and its goal is to make sure that AI systems used are safe, transparent, traceable, non-discriminatory, and environmental friendly. And the main focus is really transparency and accountability. They want to make sure that the AI models were developed with complete transparency and openness, and you can interrogate the models as regards their potential to augment the prejudice, the biases that we see. And it includes the requirement for data cards and model cards. I suspect that a lot of you here have heard of the data cards and the model cards, where the concept is no different from having a nutrition fact that you see at the back of every food at the grocery store. So every model should be accompanied by a data card and a model card. And our team is proposing that we add a third card, and that is the team card. What is the composition of the people who developed and deployed AI? So these are some of the questions that are being addressed by the data card, the model card, the team card. We want to know exactly the population who were used to train and validate the models. Who do they represent? What is their composition? In the model cards, we want to see the analytics pipeline. We also want to see the harmonization pipeline. People are saying we have to use standards, we have to use FHIR, we have to use OMOP, but you can imagine that we're adding another layer of bias as soon as we harmonize data from its raw format. And we want to see that pipeline. How did the data transform from its raw version to its FHIR version or its OMOP version? And finally, we wanted to make sure that we're also understanding who are the people behind this AI model, and that is the idea behind the team card. So the second requirement that I've already been speaking about is the requirement for an open, extensive dialogue and discussion and design thinking in the development and validation of artificial intelligence. The idea that a single group would have the quote-unquote expertise to identify all the biases that exist in the data is really AI, arrogant and ignorant. Whether that group is from U of T or MIT and Harvard, we will have the same blind spots. We will not see all the data biases. We need to bring in more people who have different training from us. And if AI is truly able to improve healthcare delivery around the world, we need more databases coming from those who are disproportionately burdened by diseases and disasters. This is a paper that we did over the pandemic, and we showed nicely that at that time, 50%, close to 50% of the databases that are used to build models are coming from the United States. Most of the world are spectators in this AI revolution. The biggest contribution of artificial intelligence, to my mind, is shining a spotlight on the data, shining a spotlight on the medical knowledge system that feeds our understanding of health and disease, the medical knowledge system that informs how we diagnose, how we prevent, how we treat diseases. And increasingly, we have become more self-critical of what this medical knowledge system looks like. The medical knowledge is maintained by gatekeepers, and these are the people who determine what research should be performed. So these are the governments, the funders, the foundations. This is also controlled by the people who perform the research. So these are the universities, this is the industry. And finally, this is controlled by the groups that disseminate research. So these are the journals and the media as well that would megaphone your research findings. The same medical knowledge system, unfortunately, has enabled a research where 80% of the clinical trials are performed in 20% of the countries. It has also enabled this, what we call the 1090 gap, where 10% of expenditure in health research and development is used for health problems that affect 90% of the global population. So there, as you could see, there's a large gap there. There's a large divide in where we're spending our money on, as well as who are the people who will be impacted by the research that we are doing. So the question that has haunted me in the last few months is that, can we really have any value from AI without us fixing the world? And my answer is unlikely. If we're able to leverage this very powerful technology, we have to fix the world at the same time. And what does that look like? What does fixing the world look like? It means that we have to revamp the incentive structures that have preserved the knowledge imbalance. We have to make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion are at the heart of how research is funded. We have to make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion is also at the heart of how research is being shared with the rest of the world, how knowledge is being developed, discovered, and validated. And on that note, we introduce this concept of diversity factor for journals. We know that journals have a huge role in identifying what is science, what is knowledge. And we also know that they have enabled the disparities in the research that has resulted. So isn't it time to make them accountable? So instead of just relying on the impact factor, and for those of you who are not familiar with the impact factor, it is just a measure of how frequent articles from that journal is being cited. We want to replace that with the diversity factor. How well are those journals promoting cross-disciplinary collaboration? Are they allowing more researchers from those who are disproportionately burdened by disease and disasters to contribute to science? And diversity, equity, and inclusion should also be at the heart of how students are graded, how faculty are promoted. So instead of just looking at the number of publications, the number of citations, let's look at how well they promote collaboration across the aisles, across the countries. And are they sharing their data? Because we know that data sharing truly promotes the collaboration that we see across countries, across disciplines. Are they contributing open source software? We think that these are more relevant measures now if we are to really change the course of how we perform research. And we need to revamp the medical knowledge system so that it does not preserve the knowledge imbalance that I have been describing to you all along. So the last couple of slides, I remember this video that I saw in May, and it struck me because of the lessons that I learned from watching the video. And in this video, there was a team of men playing basketball, and at one point, they managed to entangle the net. And they had to stop. And all the men tried to jump as high as they could to disentangle the net, and no one could. And they had to stop the game, they left. And within a few minutes of stopping the game, the women's cheerleading squad went into the court, they formed a pyramid, and in less than 1 minute, they solved the problem. And there are 3 lessons from that video. The first is that competition kills collaboration, the collaboration that we need to address complex problems. All the men are trying to out-jump each other. In AI, we hear the phrases, my data is bigger than yours, my learning is deeper than yours. It is not gonna work. If we are to solve the health problems that we have, we have to focus on collaboration. The second lesson is that you cannot solve problems if you only work with people with the same training as you are. The men could not see the problem from different perspectives. And the third lesson is that the problems cannot be solved by the same people who created the problem or who preserves the problem in the first place. We need to bring in more diverse perspectives. We need to bring in different eyes that could look at the problem from different angles. And finally, you've heard this saying before, every system is perfectly designed to achieve exactly the results that it gets. But what are we talking about when we say the system? The system is not just the organizational chart. It's not just a compendium of policies. The system is talking about how we work together, how we learn together, and how we learn from each other. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Celi. That was fantastic. Always inspiring. Do we have questions from the audience? If you could use the Slido platform, that would be fantastic. Actually, we do have one right now. All right. So what do you think about race, gender, bias-specific algorithms, for example, sickle cell anemia or schizophrenia in Ashkenazi?
I do not have the expertise. None of us here has the expertise to answer that. I think this question should be brought out where we have open discussion, open dialogue, and truly engage people who will be affected by those algorithms. And that is really my answer to all the questions. Unfortunately, I am not smart enough. I do not have a wide perspective and understanding of the problem. But one thing that I could say is it's pointless to hide these sensitive attributes from the algorithm. One of our papers from 2 years ago, we showed nicely that even if you think these features are invisible to the algorithm, they are not. We've heard about shortcut features, clever hands features. The computers are smarter than us. They could see invisible features. So some examples is the study that I just mentioned, where we were able to train an algorithm to identify the race ethnicity based on the images without any clinical data. We have a paper that we are about to release that we were able to train an algorithm using normal chest x-rays, no radiologic abnormalities, and we were able to train the algorithm to identify what your insurance status is. Are you Medicare, Medicaid versus private insurance? So it sees these very small things in the joints, in the lungs, in the heart that would allow the computer to tell if you're rich or poor. And we also have heard about algorithms trained on fundus photos of the back of the eye, where it could tell if you're a man or a woman. And ophthalmologists are shocked because they themselves cannot identify that. And the reason why this is so alarming is that in this age of multimodal modeling, if the computers can tell if you're rich or poor, if you're binary or non-binary, if you are morbidly obese or not, if you are disabled or not, even though we think that that information is not available to them, they're going to start using that to make decisions. After all, we're training computers using human data. And after all, we know that as humans, we have this biases. We call them social determinants of care, non-clinical determinants of care. The way we deliver care is based on how we see someone, how we hear someone. So we still have a lot of homework to do. And I think that trying to hide these sensitive attributes is not the way to do it. I think we need to actually find out how can we use them so that our algorithms in the end will have an output that will inch us closer to the world that we aspire to have.
Great response. So here's a fairly real question. What do you think about the use of generative AI to write manuscripts for us? People are starting to do it.
Yes. So let me rephrase that question. Are we going to get dumber with AI? And my answer to that question is, if you're dumb, you're going to get dumber. And if you're smart, you're going to get smarter. So just imagine a world without GPS. Just imagine if you have to take out your compass and see whether you're going north or south. what we have done now is unimaginable when they did not have GPS. The people who created the internet had no clue of what the internet is gonna provide. So to me, it's up to us if we can leverage this powerful technology. And I'm all for using generative AI to advance our knowledge and not ban the use. Italy tried to do that, and of course, it worked for maybe 12 hours. So I think we should be teaching our students how to use generative AI and use it to their advantage.
Yeah, that's a great answer. We're going to see more and more people using generative AI to actually do all sorts of things that maybe we shouldn't be doing. This is a pretty important question. It goes along the whole theme of your talk. And I hear this all the time. Is there any idea in general how to correct the selection bias in collecting data? Now, some people will say, all right, well, it starts with, first of all, having the right sample to collect from or samples, but then once you've collected it, how do you correct for biases?
So there are some initiatives coming from the National Institute of Health that I'm hoping will spill over to the rest of the world, where they're really focusing on addressing the social patterning of the data generation process and really making sure that everyone has a seat at the table. And that requires, of course, capacity building because we need AI developers from the indigenous communities. We need AI developers from the poorest countries of the world because their perspective of the problem is what we need to be able to create an AI-fueled world that will be better. And my answer is going to be the same. No one knows the answer. It always irks me when I read a paper or a submission that said that we have fixed the data bias. Our database is completely rid of any bias, and therefore our algorithms are fair. And this is where I think we should really focus our investment, our energy, is trying to come up with ways to truly build fair AI models. The metrics that we have right now to assess fairness, unfortunately, are all garbage. They came from the Harvards, the MITs, the U of Ts. And who are we to define what fairness is? What experiences do we have to give us the authority to actually say this is fair and this is not fair? So somehow it really requires a whole revamping, overhauling of the way we formulate the questions and we answer the questions. So I'm hoping that there are more questions like this. I'm hoping that this will be the topics for future datathons because no one knows the answers. Like, we have been trying to do this for the last almost decade and we still don't have any answers for people.
Yeah, it's certainly a tough area. One of the questions is around, do you think we need some sort of legislation or formal governance to actually address some of the issues that you're bringing up?
We do, and I said that that's one of the requirements for us to be able to forge a path where we will truly benefit from AI as a technology. We are working on a paper, and it's funny how complicated that is. So in our paper, what we are promoting is that there has to be complete transparency on who data brokers are selling health data to. So we want to know who Apple is selling the wearable data that they collect. Are they selling it to employers? Are they selling it to insurance companies? But it's much more complicated. It sounds very good, except that the data that is being collected by Apple for now is considered wellness data, so it's not under the purview of the FDA. And they're also de-identified. And it's shocking to learn that once a data is de-identified, patients no longer have any ownership of that data. That's how it is set up now. So we're having this huge argument. There are lawyers and bioethicists but I think the conclusion is that the legal frameworks that we have now, the legal frameworks behind HIPAA, which was formulated in the middle of the 1990s when we don't have as much data yet, they need to be re-examined. They need to be reformulated because they are very pro-industry for now, all these regulations. And that's because they have a louder voice at the Hill. The lobbyists are able to preserve their interests, and no one is really speaking on behalf of the patients whose voices have been muted because we don't have the power. So for sure, regulation is gonna take a major role in really forging this path. And I would love to follow the EU AI Act. I think that what they have is a good start. But at the same time, I keep thinking about the GDPR, which is also not very friendly towards making sure that data is being looked at by tens and thousands of pairs of eyes, because that's what we need. We need groups of groups to be looking, curating, and analyzing the data. And we need the pipeline for curation, the pipeline for analysis to be completely open. And the GDPR somehow has hurt those initiatives. So, and I think it's because the people who are coming up with these laws, again, do not have all the necessary lived experiences to be able to come up with more comprehensive and more patient-centric views. So I go back to my original suggestion that rather than addressing the what of AI, we need to focus on the who and the how. We have to have investments not just on the databases and the computational resources. We have to invest in capacity building, especially among those who have been historically marginalized in society.
That's great. I think we've got time for one more question. I'm going to pick one here. There's a lot of questions, by the way, which is fantastic. You guys are awesome. This one kind of hits home a little bit. So how do you protect or balance addressing bias with the privacy issues that come about? And I'll give you an example. I know we harp a lot on, for example, at our institution, we really want to do bias assessments and such. We don't have race data. And so we'd love to be able to collect that race data, and people advocate for it, and they say, well, you need to actually make sure that you're fair in terms of all races. And then when we go to collect race data, people who feel the racialized say, I don't want you having my data. So how do you tackle that paradigm?
So we have this project, and we would love more people to get involved in this particular research focus, where the idea is rather than using traditional labels such as race, ethnicity, or sexual identity, and we know that they are very poorly captured. Maybe we could start with looking at the actual care that people are getting. So I alluded to the social determinants of care. So when you start looking at interventions, what you're going to find is that there is a distribution of how that intervention is allocated that is not explained by clinical features. So maybe we could create new labels. And these new labels are less likely to focus on group identities where harmful associations would come in. But these are labels pertaining to what kind of care did you get. And then you start using that now as a new label rather than reverting to race, ethnicity, or sexual identity. Here's a label where you got the least amount of this particular intervention. So 2 of the interventions that we are examining using the MIMIC database is how often does your mouth get cleaned when you're intubated. So there's a protocol that your mouth has to be cleaned every 4 hours because that increases your risk of developing ventilator-associated pneumonia. And what we find is there's a huge distribution in terms of who are getting their mouth cleaned every 4 hours. We find, for example, that people who have limited English proficiency, they get much less care. So rather than just using their race, ethnicity to see what kind of care they're getting, we start off with what is the care that you're getting, and let's create a new label for that. And we start using that now to see if the model is performing well for this particular group. And we try to start predicting what's the impact of your algorithm to this particular group of people. And it moves us away from this identifying the group identities. So I'd love to talk to anyone who's interested in doing this. What we wanted to do is to create a knowledge graph of the different new labels and see how they overlap, how they map with the traditional labels, which we know are very imperfect. So that might be a solution to this, because no one would care if you're identified as, oh, I'm receiving the worst care in this particular health system. That's safer than saying that I'm non-binary, I'm Asian, or I have Medicare as my insurance, because there's no stigma attached to those particular labels.
I love that approach. So it doesn't see race, religion, gender. That's fantastic. This has been fantastic. Everyone, please give a round of applause to Dr. Celi. Fantastic talk.